3 years in prison. Let that sink in for a moment. 3 years. That's what you get in America for taking someone's life, wrapping their body in black construction plastic like garbage and dumping it in the woods 30 miles away. 3 years behind bars. Then you walk free. You go home to your wife and child. You live your life. You get to grow old. The woman you killed, she never got that chance. She never got to graduate. Never got to move to Colorado like she'd dreamed. Never got to walk down the aisle. Never got to have children of her own. Never got to see 30, 40, 50 years old. Her father will spend the rest of his life wondering what she could have become. Her younger sister lost her role model at just 15 years old. Her friends will forever have a hole in their lives where she should have been. And the man who took all of that away, the man who stood at her funeral and hugged her father, knowing full well what he'd done, the man who searched alongside volunteers, cried on camera, and played the devastated fiancé for over a decade. He served 3 years. This is the story of Caitlyn Markham, a young woman who had her entire future ahead of her until the person who claimed to love her the most decided she didn't deserve one. This is the story of how someone can commit murder, hide in plain sight for 13 years, and walk away with barely any consequences. This is a story about manipulation, about deception, about a justice system that sometimes fails the people it's meant to protect. This is The Untold Cold Case. What you're about to hear is the complete timeline of events that led to Caitlyn Markham's disappearance, the investigation that took over a decade to solve, and the shocking conclusion that left her family devastated all over again. Every detail comes from police reports, court documents, witness statements, and family interviews. This is not speculation. This is what happened. In the summer of 2011, 21-year-old Caitlyn Markham was living in Fairfield, Ohio, a quiet suburban community nestled in Butler County with a population of just over 40,000 residents. Fairfield was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where violent crime was almost unheard of, where families felt safe raising their children. It was a community built on trust and familiarity, the kind of place where something like what happened to Caitlyn simply didn't happen. Caitlyn herself was difficult to miss if you knew her, not because she was loud or demanded attention, but because there was something inherently creative and vibrant about the way she moved through the world. Friends and family described her as a little eccentric in the best possible way, thoughtful, sweet, someone who saw art and possibility in everything around her. She'd been drawn to creativity since childhood, gravitating toward paintbrushes and canvases the way some kids gravitate toward sports or music. Art wasn't just a hobby for Caitlyn, it was how she processed the world, how she expressed herself, how she found peace. You could often find her with a paintbrush stuck in her hair, forgotten as she searched for her next project, her next canvas, her next opportunity to create something beautiful. By 2011, Caitlyn had turned that childhood passion into a career path. She was enrolled as a graphic arts student at the Art Institute of Ohio in Cincinnati, just a short drive from her Fairfield townhouse. She was weeks away from graduating, weeks away from holding that diploma in her hands and officially beginning the next chapter of her life. Everything she'd worked toward was finally coming together. To support herself while she finished school, Caitlyn worked part-time at a local bridal shop. It was fitting in a way. She was surrounded by white dresses and dreams of future weddings, helping other women prepare for one of the most important days of their lives. And Caitlyn had her own wedding on the horizon. She was engaged to a man named John Carter. They'd been together for 6 years, engaged for 1. To anyone looking from the outside, they seemed like a creative young couple building a life together. John was 23 years old, 2 years older than Caitlyn, and like her, he was deeply involved in the arts. He taught glassblowing classes, a skill he was passionate about, and had turned into a career. John would later tell reporters how he got his start. He'd delivered a pizza to the glassblowing studio and was so fascinated by what he saw that he asked to volunteer his time. That volunteer work turned into a 9-month internship, which eventually became his full-time career. He loved it, and by all accounts, he was good at it. Caitlyn and John had been making plans, big plans. They were going to move to Colorado together in the coming months, start fresh, build a new life in a new state, get married, grow old together. It was all mapped out. Caitlyn was pragmatic like that. She was a planner, someone who set goals and followed through. Her father, Dave, would later describe her as the kind of person who had a plan and stuck to it. She wasn't impulsive. She didn't make reckless decisions. That's what made everything that happened next so incomprehensible. August 2011 should have been one of the best months of Caitlyn's life. Her 22nd birthday was just days away. Graduation was just weeks away. The move to Colorado was just months away. Everything she'd been working toward was finally within reach. She was standing at the edge of her future, ready to step into everything she'd dreamed of. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, cracks that most people didn't see, cracks that Caitlyn had been trying to hide. She had a younger sister named Allie, who was just 15 years old at the time. Caitlyn was close with Allie in the way older sisters often are with younger siblings. She was a role model, someone Allie looked up to and admired, someone she went to for advice and support. And then there was her father, Dave. Dave Markham adored his daughter. He was proud of her creativity, her drive, her determination. He watched her grow from a little girl with a paintbrush into a young woman with a future. He believed in her, and she knew it. To Dave, Caitlyn was positive, outgoing, motivated. She had goals, and she chased them. She wasn't the kind of person who gave up or walked away from her responsibilities. She was reliable, dependable, the kind of daughter every parent hopes to raise. So when Caitlyn vanished without a trace on August 14th, 2011, it shattered every assumption anyone had about who she was and what she was capable of. The last confirmed sighting of Caitlyn alive came from a friend who visited her townhouse on the evening of August 13th. This friend would later tell police that he, Caitlyn, and John had spent the evening together. It was a typical night, casual, low-key. They smoked together and talked about Caitlyn and John's upcoming move to Colorado, discussing logistics and timelines and what life might look like in a new state. The friend noticed Caitlyn sitting on the couch with her laptop, working on schoolwork. She seemed focused on what she was doing. But there was something else he noticed too. She seemed distant, quiet, not her typical bubbly, energetic self. She didn't really engage in the conversation the way she normally would. She stayed on the couch the entire evening, barely moving, lost in whatever was on her screen, or maybe just lost in her own thoughts. At the time, the friend didn't think much of it. People have off days, people get tired. Maybe she was stressed about graduation or the move, or just had a lot on her mind. He left the townhouse around 10:45 that night, leaving Caitlyn and John alone together. It was the last time anyone outside of that townhouse would see Caitlyn Markham alive. What happened in the hours that followed remains, in many ways, a mystery. There are pieces of the puzzle, fragments of information, but the complete picture of that night has never been fully revealed. What we do know is this: by the next evening, August 14th, Caitlyn was gone. Her car sat parked in the driveway of her townhouse, eyed exactly where it should have been. But Caitlyn wasn't at work. She hadn't shown up to her shift at the bridal shop, which was unusual. Caitlyn was responsible. She didn't just skip work without calling. Inside the townhouse, there were no signs of a struggle, no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared broken or out of place. But Caitlyn's cell phone was missing, and her dog was wandering around the house alone, which was alarming to anyone who knew Caitlyn. She would never leave her dog unattended like that. When Caitlyn didn't respond to calls or texts, when her phone went straight to voicemail, people started to worry. Friends tried to reach her. Family tried to reach her. No one could get through. John Carter, her fiancé, went to her townhouse after a full day of not hearing from her. He found the car. he found the dog, but he didn't find Caitlyn. At 8 o'clock in the evening on August 14th, 2011, John Carter called 911 to report his fiancée missing. The call was recorded, and in listening to it you can hear what sounds like genuine panic in his voice. John told the dispatcher, "Hi, my name is John Carter. I am calling, I know that you're not supposed to report a missing person before 24 hours, but my fiancée is missing. I can't find her anywhere." The dispatcher asked him where he'd last seen her. John responded, "I saw her at like 12 o'clock last night. She stays in a house by herself, so I'm just really nervous. Her car is still there." The dispatcher pressed for more details. "Where was she at midnight last night when you left?" "She was at her house," John said. "She was going to bed."
She wasn't going out to do anything, so she would have been in her bed. And I mean, I've been with her for 6 years. She's not deceiving, you know? She doesn't. The dispatcher asked if they'd had an argument. "Not at all," John replied quickly. "The only thing that's not there is her cell phone, which is positive, but she's not answering it. So, and then Sacred Heart Festival is going on right up the street, and there's a lot of questionable people there, and it just kind of... I'm sorry." John explained to the dispatcher that he'd last seen Caitlyn around midnight the night before when he was leaving her townhouse. He lived with his mother just a 5-minute walk away. He said they'd exchanged a few text messages after he left, but then a few hours later, Caitlyn had stopped responding. He sent her a good morning text. No reply.
He tried calling. Straight to voicemail. When police arrived at Caitlyn's townhouse to meet with John and assess the situation, the first thing they noticed were scratches on his neck, visible scratches that looked fresh. John was asked about them. He explained that they were from his electric razor. Then he seemed to second-guess himself and admitted he wasn't actually sure where the scratches came from, but he insisted it was nothing suspicious, nothing nefarious. He was just exhausted, losing sleep, worried sick about his fiancée. All he wanted was for Caitlyn to come home safe. Police spoke with Caitlyn's father, Dave, and her younger sister, Allie. Neither of them had any idea where Caitlyn could be. This wasn't like her. She didn't just disappear. She didn't go off without telling anyone. She was too pragmatic for that. Too responsible. Dave told investigators she's positive, outgoing, and motivated. She had a plan and she was sticking to it. She would never just leave. She's just too pragmatic. After what they described as intense scrutiny of John Carter, detectives made an announcement that would shape the direction of the investigation for years to come. They said that John Carter was not a person of interest at that time. Their attention, they said, was moving elsewhere. And with that, the search for Caitlyn Markham began. Within hours of Caitlyn being reported missing, the town of Fairfield transformed into a command center. This was a small community where everyone knew everyone, and when one of their own went missing, people showed up. About 100 people gathered off Pedersen Boulevard. Key police and fire departments set up mobile command units. Search teams were organized and divided into groups. Some searched on foot. Others used cars. Some even used all-terrain vehicles to cover more ground. They combed through woods, streets, parks, waterways, anywhere Caitlyn might be. The local news media descended on Fairfield almost immediately. This was a story that had everything: a young woman on the brink of achieving her dreams, a mysterious disappearance with no clear answers, and a community desperate to bring her home. John Carter stood before news cameras, his face drawn, his voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Caitlyn is the love of my life," he said. "I've been with her for 6 years. We've been engaged for a year. Today would be exactly a year. Today is also her birthday. August 14th. The day Caitlyn was reported missing was also the 1-year anniversary of their engagement. And it was her 22nd birthday. Instead of celebrating with red velvet cake or dinner at Red Lobster like they'd planned, John was standing in front of cameras, begging for information about where she might be. "I'm terrified," John continued. "I'm absolutely terrified. I just want to find Caitlyn and celebrate her birthday with her and go to Red Lobster like she was planning. That's all I want to do." The search efforts intensified. Friends, family members, neighbors, and complete strangers showed up to help look for Caitlyn. They passed out flyers with her picture and information. They walked the streets calling her name. They searched every inch of Fairfield and the surrounding areas. The E1 News reporter described the scene. Instead of celebrating Caitlyn Markham's birthday, family, friends, and police are searching for the 22-year-old. Friends spoke to reporters about who Caitlyn was and why this disappearance made no sense. To just go unseen without telling anybody is extremely out of the ordinary, one friend said. I just really would like to communicate that this is not part of who Caitlyn is. Another friend described her as a responsible young woman, a dedicated student at the Art Institute of Cincinnati, a reliable employee, someone who showed up when she was supposed to show up, someone who communicated, someone who didn't just vanish. The last confirmed contact anyone had with Caitlyn was a text message she sent to John. According to John, Caitlyn had sent him a picture of herself. That was the last message he received from her. When Caitlyn never showed up for her shift at David's Bridal, her co-workers immediately began to worry. One co-worker later told reporters, I kept texting her, no response, no response. I called her, no response, I have nothing. Police held a press conference and addressed the media. They stated there was no evidence of foul play at that time, just a missing woman and a cell phone that couldn't be traced. But behind the scenes, investigators were quietly gathering information. They were building a timeline, pulling phone records, interviewing witnesses, trying to piece together what had happened. Phone records showed that text messages were sent from Caitlyn's phone to John's phone between 11:04 in the evening and 11:36 in the evening on August 13th. Would the messages appeared normal, back and forth conversation, nothing unusual, but then nothing. At 12:06 in the morning on August 14th, Caitlyn's phone either died, was turned off, or had its SIM card removed. There was no activity after that point, no calls, no text, no data usage. The phone went dark. And that's where the digital trail went cold. Investigators began digging deeper into Caitlyn's life, looking for any clues that might explain her disappearance. And what they found started to paint a more complicated picture of her relationship with John Carter. Police interviewed the manager of a credit union in Fairfield. The manager told them that 3 weeks before Caitlyn's disappearance on July 20th, 2011, Caitlyn had come into the credit union. She wasn't alone. She was with John's mother. According to the manager, Caitlyn told her she wanted to apply for a credit card and John's mother was going to co-sign for it. The manager remembered the interaction vividly because of what happened next. John's mother joked, I'll co-sign for the visa, but you've got to take my son to Colorado with you. The manager, laughing, turned to Caitlyn and said, I guess you're stuck now. But Caitlyn didn't laugh. She didn't smile. Her expression was somber, serious, almost uncomfortable. The manager got the distinct impression that the credit card wasn't Caitlyn's idea, that perhaps she was being pressured into it, that maybe she didn't want John's mother so involved in their relationship and their financial decisions. In the end, the credit card was never set up. Nothing came of it, but the interaction stuck with the manager as odd. As a red flag, perhaps, that things weren't as perfect between Caitlyn and John as they appeared to be. Another witness came forward with more information about the night of August 13th. This was the friend who had been at Caitlyn's townhouse that evening. He told police that he, Caitlyn, and John had spent time together. They'd smoked marijuana and discussed Caitlyn and John's plans to move to Colorado within the next few months. He said Caitlyn had been on her laptop working on schoolwork the entire time. She didn't move from the couch. She seemed distant. Not her typical bubbly self. She was quiet, withdrawn, lost in thought. He left around 10:45 in the evening, leaving Caitlyn and John alone in the townhouse. It was the last time he saw Caitlyn. While nothing particularly stood out to him at the time beyond her being quiet, he also told police he didn't recall seeing any scratches on John's neck when he left, though he admitted it was entirely possible he just wasn't paying close enough attention to notice. Investigators asked the witness if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test. He agreed. The results indicated he gave truthful responses to all questions. He was ruled out as having any involvement in Caitlyn's disappearance. But there was one more piece of information that came from witnesses that night. In the overnight hours between August 13th and August 14th, a couple of teenagers who had snuck out of their homes told police they saw something strange. They saw two cars driving from the direction of Caitlyn's townhouse, and both cars had their headlights off. Driving with headlights off in the middle of the night is unusual, suspicious even, but the teenagers were the only people who reported seeing anything out of the ordinary that night. And without more information, there was little police could do with that detail. The case was quickly becoming national news. Caitlyn's disappearance had all the elements that captured public attention: a young woman with a bright future, a loving family desperate for answers, a fiancé pleading for her safe return, and absolutely no clear explanation for where she'd gone or what had happened to her. Vigils were held, rallies organized, television appeals broadcast. Volunteers continued searching day and night, determined to bring Caitlyn home. A national mounted search group from Texas even traveled to Ohio to assist. They conducted dozens of searches, combing through local parks, waterways, old train tracks, and areas in neighboring counties. Every possible location was investigated. Every lead was followed up on. Caitlyn's family was everywhere. In the media, at vigils leading search efforts, they refused to give up. They refused to accept that Caitlyn was just gone, and John Carter was right there with them, in every news interview, at every search, at every vigil, playing the role of the devastated fiancé. He told reporters, "I keep believing that if she is somewhere in the worst-case scenario, that she fights her way out. I keep wanting to believe that because she's strong. I know she's strong." But not everyone was convinced by John's performance. There were whispers in the community, suspicions. Some people believed he knew more than he was saying, that his story didn't quite add up, that the scratches on his neck weren't from an electric razor. When John passed out flyers one day, he was confronted by someone in the community. John later recounted the interaction to reporters. "I guess he didn't know who I was, and he was just like, okay, I heard the boyfriend did it. And I was just like, I'm the boyfriend. I would never do anything to hurt her." John told the media he felt like the entire community was pointing fingers at him, that people were blaming him without any evidence. "People are going to say what they're going to say," John said. "You can't stop them. I'm not going to acknowledge the ridiculous things that people are saying because I know. I mean, nobody's going to know about me. They don't know me, and I know me. I know that I would never hurt Caitlyn ever in a million years." Despite the public suspicion, Fairfield police continued to maintain that John Carter was not a person of interest. They had little evidence and no suspects. One officer admitted to reporters, "There's nothing and it's horrific." John tried to show that he was cooperating fully with the investigation. When police requested to search his mother's house where he lived, he gave consent. He wanted people to know he had nothing to hide. "I really did not want this to get this far," John told a reporter. "I really wish that she would have been home by now. I wish this could have been just a party for her being home instead of what it is." While John publicly maintained his innocence and his love for Caitlyn, information started coming to light that suggested their relationship wasn't as perfect as it appeared. A close friend of Caitlyn's came forward with information that would change the entire complexion of the case. She told investigators that Caitlyn had confided in her in the months leading up to her disappearance. And what Caitlyn had shared painted a very different picture of her relationship with John Carter. Caitlyn had told her friend that she was unhappy, deeply unhappy. She felt trapped in the relationship and had been feeling that way for about 6 months. She was sick of John's heavy substance use. She was tired of his behavior. Things had deteriorated so badly that she was no longer attracted to him. She was uncomfortable with the kinds of intimate activities he demanded from her. She felt pressured, coerced. John could be jealous and possessive, the friend said. If Caitlyn even spoke to another man, John would react with anger and suspicion. He would question her, accuse her, make her feel guilty for normal social interactions. As more people came forward and shared their observations, a clearer picture emerged. Caitlyn had reached the end of the line with John. She wanted out of the relationship. She wanted to move on with her life, but John wasn't willing to change his behavior, and Caitlyn couldn't justify staying with someone who was possessive, controlling, and unwilling to grow. She also felt uncomfortable with how involved John's mother was in their relationship. The credit card incident was just one example. It felt manipulative to Caitlyn, like John's mother was trying to force them to stay together financially, binding them in ways that would make it harder for Caitlyn to leave. Caitlyn was unhappy. She wanted out. But she hadn't left yet. Why? Some people wondered if maybe she'd finally had enough, if maybe she'd decided to just escape, to disappear and start fresh somewhere else without the confrontation of a breakup. But her family shut that theory down immediately. No way. Absolutely not. That wasn't who Caitlyn was. She was a problem solver. She was a communicator. If she needed help, she would have asked for it. If she wanted to leave, she would have told someone. She wouldn't have just vanished without a word. It made no sense. There was another detail that stood out to Caitlyn's friend. Just days after Caitlyn was reported missing, John had referred to her in the past tense, multiple times, as if she were already gone, already dead. And it was subtle. But it was there, and it felt wrong. Months passed. The search continued, the media coverage continued, and still there were no answers. Then in June 2012, the investigation briefly shifted focus to someone else entirely. A man named Gurpreet Kaur, who lived directly across from Caitlyn's townhouse, was accused of sexually assaulting a Miami University student. When investigators learned he lived so close to Caitlyn, they wondered if he might be connected to her disappearance. They looked into him intensely. They investigated his whereabouts on the night of August 13th. They looked for any connection between him and Caitlyn. But after a thorough investigation, Fairfield police ruled him out completely. He had nothing to do with Caitlyn's disappearance, and just like that, they were back to square one. The case was going cold, and everyone knew it. Nearly 2 years passed, 2 years of searching, 2 years of hoping, 2 years of Caitlyn's face on flyers and news broadcasts, 2 years of her family refusing to give up. The reward for information about Caitlyn's whereabouts had grown to $75,000, but tips had slowed to a trickle. The case was losing momentum, losing steam. The public was moving on to other stories, other tragedies. But Caitlyn's family refused to move on. Her name stayed alive in the media because her father, Dave, wouldn't let it die. John Carter and Caitlyn's family appeared united in their search for answers. They stood together at vigils. They gave interviews together. They presented a united front. And then on April 7th, 2013, everything changed. But news broke that sent shockwaves through the community. Tonight, a major discovery in one of the tri-states' most talked about unsolved mysteries, a news anchor announced. In a remote wooded area in Cedar Grove, Indiana, 30 miles from Caitlyn's home in Fairfield, human bones had been discovered. They were wrapped in black plastic construction sheeting, dumped in the woods, trash piled on top. Through dental records, authorities were able to confirm what everyone feared but hoped wouldn't be true. The remains belonged to Caitlyn Markham. A man named Hicks had discovered the remains while searching for scrap metal in the woods. He later described the moment to reporters. "I was just, digging through this little area here, picking up some metal, and here, found a jawbone right on the other side of that little tree."
"I would right between them two little trees," Hicks said. "He knew immediately it wasn't an animal bone, and I picked it up and I said, 'That's not no animal.' And I hung it in a tree and went and called the cops. And they sent us to the DNR. DNR says, 'Well, what makes you so sure it's a human jawbone?' And I said, 'Well, it's got all its teeth, and it's shaped just like mine.'" The discovery was horrific. Caitlyn's skull was found separately from the rest of her remains, inside a tied-up plastic bag. The medical examiner who processed the scene noted something particularly disturbing. Inside the plastic bag that contained Caitlyn's skull, there was very little soft tissue. very little decomposition fluid, and very little staining. This indicated that her head had not decomposed inside that bag.
And it had been placed inside the bag after her head had already undergone significant decomposition elsewhere. In other words, her body had been moved, disturbed, potentially dismembered. The bones had not been buried properly. They had simply been dumped in the woods with trash piled on top, as if whoever left her there wanted to hide the remains but didn't want to put in the effort to dig a grave. Investigators found evidence of sharp force trauma on Caitlyn's left wrist. There was a V-shaped incision that had shaved off a layer of bone. It was caused by some kind of sharp object, a knife, perhaps, or another cutting tool. But beyond that, there was very little physical evidence to work with. The elements had taken their toll on the remains. His decomposition had erased many of the details that might have helped investigators understand exactly what had happened to her. Her cause of death could not be definitively determined. But based on the circumstances, the location, the manner in which her body had been disposed of, it was ruled a homicide. There was no question about that. Caitlyn's cell phone was not found near her remains. It was never recovered. After nearly 2 years of hoping Caitlyn might still be alive, somewhere, her family finally had to confront the reality they'd been dreading. She was gone. She'd been gone since August 2011, and now they had to plan her funeral. The funeral was held in Fairfield. Caitlyn's artwork lined the walls of the venue. Everyone wore bright colors, the way Caitlyn would have wanted. It was a celebration of her life.
Yeah, her creativity, her spirit. People stood up and shared memories. They talked about her talent, her kindness, her potential. And John Carter was there, standing among the mourners, giving a speech. "We would have had our kiss," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "We would have had our marriage. We would have had our honeymoon. We would have had our kids. And we would have had our life. And we would grow old together." One of John's cousins spoke to a reporter after the funeral. "Whenever I think of her, I just think of this smile and this artwork. And she was just a colourful human being. She meant well to everybody. Everybody was a friend." Dave, Caitlyn's father, stood among the mourners and tried to process the impossible. Although finding Caitlyn's remains gave them some measure of closure, knowing she was gone for certain.
But it also opened up new pain. He thought about Ali, Caitlyn's younger sister, who had been just 15 when Caitlyn disappeared. "Some days I get so consumed with Caitlyn," Dave said. "Her baby sister lost such an important role model in her life." Finding Caitlyn's remains presented significant challenges for the investigation. Her body had been found in Indiana, not Ohio. That meant different jurisdictions, different police departments, different sets of protocols and procedures. Investigators didn't believe Caitlyn had been originally placed in that Indiana location. They believed she'd been killed somewhere else, likely in Ohio, and then transported across state lines to be dumped. Both the Ohio and Indiana police teams needed to work together, coordinate, share information. And that kind of interstate cooperation, while necessary, slowed things down. The start of 2015 began the same way the previous 2 years had begun. Quietly, with little movement. The reward for information was still sitting at $75,000. But with the passage of time, the case was losing steam. Tips weren't coming in the way they used to. The media had moved on to other stories. The public's attention had shifted, and Dave couldn't accept that. He couldn't accept that his daughter's murder might become just another cold case, just another unsolved file sitting in a drawer somewhere, forgotten. Dave successfully lobbied the Butler County Sheriff's Office to re-examine the case. He wanted fresh eyes on it, a new approach, new investigators who might see something that had been missed. As the investigation officially changed hands from the Fairfield Police Department to the Butler County Sheriff's Office. And Dave hoped that change might make all the difference. Dave also took matters into his own hands. He contacted a private investigator named J. Ryan Green and hired him to look into Caitlyn's case independently. Green was thorough. He made his way into Caitlyn and John's inner circle. He interviewed more than a dozen people connected to the case. He asked questions, he followed leads, he looked for inconsistencies. 5 people, excluding John Carter, agreed to take polygraph tests administered by Green, and from those interviews and tests, Green narrowed down his investigation to 2 primary suspects. 2 people, he believed, knew more than they were saying. Green later spoke publicly about his findings. Subject 1 took a polygraph and failed the polygraph in epic proportion, per the polygraph examiner, Green said. A documentary about Caitlyn's case, titled Taken Too Soon, The Caitlyn Markham Story, was produced and shown at a Springdale movie theatre in hopes of generating new leads. The screening brought the community together again. It reminded people that Caitlyn's case was still unsolved, that her killer was still out there. Towards the end of 2016, police made an announcement that gave Dave hope. They said they now had a person of interest in Caitlyn's case, but they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest, and they wouldn't name the person publicly. Private investigator Green shared the same view. He believed he knew exactly who was responsible for Caitlyn's death, and it was the same person the police were looking at. But knowing and proving are 2 very different things. Years passed, and still, no arrest was made. We now flash forward to 2023, 12 years after Caitlyn went missing. 12 years of her family waiting for justice. 12 years of John Carter living his life, getting married, having a child, moving on. And then finally, the investigation picked up pace again. Police made their first arrest, but it wasn't John Carter. I do know there's a warrant for you, but I'm not sure exactly what it's for, so they'll be able to explain all that stuff to you when we get there, an officer could be heard saying on body camera footage. A man named Jonathan Palmton was arrested and charged with perjury in connection with Caitlyn's case. Private investigator Green commented on the arrest. Whoever's investigating this now is on the right track. They've got momentum, and they have something that would allow a judge to sign off on a search warrant. So who was Jonathan Palmton, and why did his arrest matter? Jonathan Palmton was part of Caitlyn, John, and their circle of friends. He knew them both well. He lived close to Caitlyn's townhouse. And most importantly, he was John Carter's best friend. In fact, when John went to Caitlyn's townhouse on the morning of August 14, 2011, the morning he reported her missing, the first person he called wasn't the police. It was Jonathan Palmton. Prior to Palmton's arrest, investigators had executed search warrants on 2 separate properties. One was where Jonathan lived in 2011. It's around the same time Caitlyn went missing. The other was the house where John Carter had lived at the time with his mother. According to the indictment against Palmton, on April 21, 2022, he lied under oath during testimony related to Caitlyn's case. He was indicted almost 6 months later in October, but the indictment remained sealed until his arrest in 2023. Prosecutors believed Palmton knew something, that he'd helped John in some way, that he'd lied to protect his best friend. There was another connection that caught investigators' attention. Jonathan Palmton and John Carter were both close to a man named Michael Strauss. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Michael Strauss is someone this channel has actually covered before in a previous case. Michael Strauss pleaded guilty to stalking and murdering a woman named Ellie White. He was sentenced to 17 years to life in prison. After his conviction, Michael Strauss made admissions that suggested Ellie White was not the first person he had killed. Police began looking at him in connection with other unsolved cases, including Caitlyn's. There were some surface-level connections between Caitlyn's case and Ellie's case. Similar age ranges, similar circumstances in some ways, and the fact that Michael knew both John and Jonathan added another layer. But after a thorough investigation, police eventually ruled Michael Strauss out of Caitlyn's case. He wasn't involved, which brought investigators right back to where they'd been for over a decade, back to the same person they'd suspected from the beginning, John Carter. Since Caitlyn's remains had been found in 2013, John had largely stayed out of the media. He'd stopped giving interviews, stopped appearing at vigils. He'd moved on with his life in a very visible way. By 2023, John was 36 years old. He was married to a new woman. He had a child. He had a job. He appeared to be living a normal, quiet life. But investigators had never stopped looking at him. And over the last several years, they'd been building a case, gathering evidence, connecting dots. It was all circumstantial. There was no DNA evidence, no murder weapon, no confession, no eyewitnesses, but there was a pattern, a web of lies, a timeline that didn't add up. See, remember the two teenagers who reported seeing two cars driving away from Caitlyn's townhouse with their headlights off on the night she disappeared? Investigators eventually determined those two vehicles matched cars owned by John Carter and Jonathan Palmton. Phone records showed that John had deleted numerous text messages between him and Caitlyn from the hours of 8 in the evening to 8:36 in the evening on August 13th. Why delete those specific messages? What did they contain? And that good morning text John claimed he sent to Caitlyn on August 14th? Phone records showed he never actually sent it. He'd lied about that detail to the 911 dispatcher and to investigators. John had voluntarily participated in 3 separate polygraph tests over the years. One in September 2011, i.e. shortly after Caitlyn disappeared. One in February 2014 after her remains were found, and a final one in January 2021, a full decade after her death. He failed all 3 tests. Polygraphs aren't admissible in court. They can't be used as evidence of guilt, but they can guide an investigation. They can tell investigators where to look, what questions to ask, who to scrutinize. During his final polygraph in 2021, the examiner noted that John showed particularly strong deceptive responses when asked whether he had disposed of Caitlyn's body on Big Cedar Road in Indiana. Big Cedar Road, the exact location where Caitlyn's remains were eventually found. A search warrant was executed at John's mother's house, the house where he'd lived in 2011. And investigators seized more than a dozen items. They found notes John had written about the investigation, as if he were tracking what police knew and what they didn't. They found a folder containing Caitlyn's school papers. Why would he have kept those? They found an SD card with unknown contents, and they found poetry, disturbing poetry about death and killing. Some of the writings had John's name on them. One piece of poetry read, in part, "Deep down, I love her. You ought to kill her, but I love her. She must die. I can't kill her. Yes, you can. No, yes. How do you talk me into all these things? I'm just that good. But you're bad. I know. How do I kill you? You can't. You're right. About what? Nothing." The writing read like an internal dialogue, an argument with himself, or perhaps a conversation with someone else, or someone encouraging him, convincing him. Investigators also found material at the house that they believed was the same type of black plastic construction sheeting that Caitlyn's remains had been wrapped in when they were found. And where had Caitlyn's remains been found? Just a short distance from a farm owned by the Carter family. As investigators dug deeper, more witnesses came forward to speak about John's behavior and temperament. Multiple people described him as volatile, aggressive, someone with a temper who could explode without warning. A video surfaced of John screaming at his current wife while she held their young child. The video was disturbing. It showed a side of John that many people hadn't seen publicly before. When detectives sat down with John and presented some of the evidence they'd gathered, his reaction was telling. He showed very little emotion, very little concern. He seemed detached, calculating. And when pressed about certain inconsistencies in his story, John made a comment that stood out to investigators. He said the evidence was all circumstantial. It was an odd choice of words. Most innocent people, when confronted with accusations, don't analyze the strength of the evidence against them. They don't use legal terminology. They simply deny. They get angry. They demand to know why they're being accused. But John seemed to be evaluating the case against him as if he were his own defense attorney, as if he'd been thinking about this for years, preparing for this moment. Despite the circumstantial nature of the evidence, despite the lack of DNA or a smoking gun, investigators felt confident they had enough to present to the district attorney. They believed John Carter had killed Caitlyn Markham. They believed he'd disposed of her body with help from someone else, likely Jonathan Palmton. They believed he'd lied for over a decade. And they believed they could prove it. In March 2023, 12 years after Caitlyn's disappearance, police finally made their move. John Carter was arrested at his place of work. He was handcuffed and taken into custody. He was charged with 2 counts of murder. The first count alleged that he purposely caused Caitlyn's death on or around August 13th or August 14th, 2011. The second count alleged that he caused her death on those same dates as an approximate result of committing or attempting to commit a violent felony offense. John posted a $1 million bond as a condition of his bond, but he was required to wear a GPS monitoring device. He was allowed to go home, to be with his wife and child, to await trial. Jonathan Palmton was scheduled to appear in court on the perjury charge, but in a surprising turn of events, the charge against him was later dismissed. Prosecutors never explained why publicly. John Carter pleaded not guilty at his arraignment. A trial was scheduled for June 2024. The prosecution subpoenaed more than 50 people to potentially testify. They were building their case, preparing to present everything they'd gathered over more than a decade to a jury. Caitlyn's family braced themselves for a trial, for reliving everything all over again, for sitting in a courtroom and listening to every horrific detail of what had happened to their daughter, their sister, their loved one. But the trial never happened, because in a move that shocked almost everyone, John Carter changed his strategy. After more than a decade of denials, after years of playing the devastated fiancé, after standing at Caitlyn's funeral and hugging her father while knowing exactly what he'd done, John Carter decided to change his plea. In court, his attorney stood and made an announcement. Mr. Carter, if we may, on his behalf, stipulates that he committed the offense of involuntary manslaughter consistent with Ohio Revised Code by the commission of a misdemeanor in the city of Fairfield, Butler County, Ohio. Involuntary manslaughter, not murder. Not even voluntary manslaughter. Involuntary manslaughter, the lowest possible homicide charge. Dave Markham, Caitlyn's father, sat in the courtroom and tried to process what he was hearing. But he described it later as an out-of-body experience. He'd known in his gut for years that John was responsible. He'd felt it, suspected it, pushed investigators to keep looking at him. And now, finally, John was admitting it. But not in the way anyone had hoped. "We knew all along who it was," Dave said, "just had to be able to prove it." The emotional weight of that moment of finally being proven right after 13 years was almost too much to bear. Dave said he felt vindicated in one sense. He hadn't been crazy. His instincts had been correct, but at the same time, he felt an overwhelming rage because John had lived for 12 years thinking he'd gotten away with it. 12 years of freedom, 12 years of building a new life, getting married, having a child, going to work, coming home, living. And now, and even though he was finally being held accountable, it felt like too little, too late. News cameras captured the moment John entered his plea. An emotional day in Butler County Court this morning as John Carter pleads guilty, admitting to causing the death of his fiancée in 2011, a reporter announced. John stood there at Caitlyn's funeral. He hugged Dave. He cried alongside the family. He joined them in searches, all while knowing full well what had happened, where she was, what he'd done. The prosecutor asked John if he could at least explain how it happened, if he could give the family some closure by telling them the truth about that night. John's response was brief, cold, empty. "I cannot," he muttered. That was it. 2 words, "I cannot." He wouldn't explain, wouldn't give details, wouldn't provide the closure the family desperately needed. But there was one version of events that came to light, though it never came from John's own mouth. An inmate who had been housed with John while he was awaiting trial, later spoke with detectives. He said that John had confided in him, had told him what really happened. According to the inmate's account, John said that he and Caitlyn had gotten into an argument. He said things escalated quickly. Before he knew it, he said, he had her pinned down on the ground. He was on top of her. And he choked her. After he choked her, according to this account, John panicked. He didn't know what to do. He thought about calling the police. But he didn't want to call the police, so instead, he tried to make it look like Caitlyn had harmed herself. He cut her. You see, he made incisions on her wrist to make it appear self-inflicted. This account, if true, would explain the sharp force trauma investigators found on Caitlyn's left wrist, the V-shaped incision that shaved off a layer of bone. But again, John never admitted any of this in court. He never confirmed this version of events. He simply said, I cannot. And so the family was left with an incomplete picture, a puzzle with missing pieces. They knew who was responsible now, but they still didn't know exactly what happened. They didn't know why. They didn't know if Caitlyn suffered. They didn't know her last words. They didn't know if she was scared. All the things a family wants to know, needs to know, to find some measure of peace, John refused to give them. Although everyone knew the sentencing would be far less than what murder would have carried, no one in that courtroom was prepared for just how little it would be. The judge addressed the court. His words were measured, careful. The court imposes the following sentence based upon the serious nature of this offence and the factors that have previously been indicated. Anything short of the maximum sentence would demean the seriousness of the offender's conduct and its impact upon the victim, and therefore the court will impose a definite term of incarceration of 36 months. 36 months, 3 years, for taking a life, for wrapping a body in plastic and dumping it in the woods, for lying to investigators for over a decade, for standing at her funeral and pretending to grieve, 3 years in prison. I mean, that was the maximum sentence allowed under Ohio law for involuntary manslaughter, a felony of the 3rd degree. The sentence would be followed by 3 years of supervised release, during which John would have to check in with a probation officer and follow certain conditions, but after that, he'd be completely free. People in the courtroom gasped, some cried, others sat in stunned silence. 3 years. Caitlyn Markham would have been 35 years old by the time of John's sentencing. She would have graduated from the Art Institute more than a decade earlier. She might have had a successful career as a graphic artist. She might have gotten married to someone who truly loved and respected her. She might have had children of her own. She might have traveled, created art, lived a full and beautiful life. But she never got that chance. Because at 21 years old, her life was taken from her. And the person who took it would serve 3 years. A detective who worked on Caitlyn's case for years spoke publicly about his interactions with John Carter. His words were chilling. I've interviewed everyone from people accused of murder down to people accused of trespassing, probably close to 1,000 people in my career, and I've never interviewed a psychopath. But that's what I said. When John left that interview room, I said, that's the first psychopath I've ever interviewed. The detective's assessment was based on John's complete lack of empathy, his detached demeanor, his ability to lie without any visible tells, his capacity to stand at Caitlyn's funeral and cry alongside her family while knowing he was responsible for her death. That takes a certain kind of person, a certain kind of disconnect from normal human emotion. Police and prosecutors also had strong suspicions that John didn't act alone. They believed someone else had helped him dispose of Caitlyn's body, possibly helped him dismember her, given the way her skull was found separately from the rest of her remains. The most likely candidate was Jonathan Palmton, John's best friend. The person he called first on the morning Caitlyn was reported missing, the person whose car was potentially one of the 2 vehicles seen driving away from Caitlyn's townhouse with headlights off. But despite their suspicions, despite the perjury charge that was initially filed against Palmton, they couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. The perjury charge was dismissed. No charges related to helping dispose of a body were ever filed. If someone did help John, they got away with it completely. And so, although Caitlyn's family finally had their answer about who was responsible for her death, they still didn't have the full story. They didn't know exactly what happened that night. They didn't know if anyone else was involved. They didn't know where Caitlyn's phone ended up. They didn't know so many things, and they probably never will. Dave Markham spoke to reporters after the sentencing. His pain was palpable, his frustration evident. "That is why there's no closure," Dave said. "I still do not know the whole story. And not that I would have believed him, because he's lied for 13 years, but he's offered no explanation, hasn't even tried. And that, to me, that just shows his character." When asked if he thought he'd ever get a real explanation from John, Dave shook his head. "No, I don't. And even if he writes a confession from prison someday, he's going to have to be more convincing than he's been for the past 13 years. The reality that Dave had to face was brutal. In just a few short years, John Carter would walk out of prison. He'd go back to his wife and child. He'd go back to his life. He'd be a free man. Meanwhile, Dave would still be living with the loss of his daughter. Ali would still be living with the loss of her sister. Caitlyn's friends would still have that hole in their lives, and nothing would bring her back. Even though the judge gave the maximum sentence allowed by law, even though his hands were tied by the sentencing guidelines for involuntary manslaughter, the lack of justice for Caitlyn was staggering, infuriating, heartbreaking. 3 years for a life. 14 years after Caitlyn was last seen alive, her family and friends gathered at a park close to her townhouse for an event called Butterflies for Caitlyn Markham. Trees were planted in her memory. Everyone wore clothing with butterflies on it, a symbol that had become associated with Caitlyn. It was a day filled with color and art and beauty, all the things Caitlyn had loved when she was alive. Dave spoke at the event. He talked about what the day meant to him, how it reminded him that he wasn't alone in his grief, that the community still remembered his daughter, that she hadn't been forgotten. "She was so bright and happy," Dave said, "exuberant, friendly, outgoing, and she liked butterflies. I don't know why exactly. But there have been days, especially in the early times after she disappeared, bad days, where a butterfly would come and fly around me. And I'd think, oh, hi, baby." He described Caitlyn as someone who was just coming into her own. Bright, vibrant, coming out of her shell, like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. Living with such a profound loss and still not knowing the complete truth about what happened was all-consuming for Dave. "Not a day goes by that I do not think of Caitlyn," he said. "Not one single day, and I do not feel 3 years is justice. Not for Caitlyn, not for her sister Ali, not for me, not for her friends, not for the entire community that has ached and grieved alongside us all these years." Dave often found himself wondering about the life Caitlyn never got to live. "I often wonder what she'd be doing with her art and her career," he said. "She would be an amazing woman by now. She had so much talent, and she was going to go someplace with it. I'll see a picture of artwork sometimes, something beautiful, and I'll think, that should be Caitlyn's work up there. But it never will be, because Caitlyn's hands will never hold a paintbrush again. Her creativity was silenced at 21 years old. All that potential, all that talent, all that life, stolen. John Carter will serve his 3-year sentence, and then he'll walk free. He'll get to grow old. He'll get to see his child grow up. He'll get to live all the moments he took away from Caitlyn. Her father will never stop missing her. Her sister will never get back the role model she lost when she was just 15. Her friends will always have that empty space where she should be. And the person responsible will face minimal consequences. This is the reality of Caitlyn Markham's case. A young woman with everything ahead of her, killed by the person who claimed to love her most. A family that fought for over a decade to get answers, an investigation that finally identified the person responsible, and a justice system that gave him 3 years. 3 years for a life taken, for a family destroyed, for over a decade of lies. John Carter will serve his time and walk free. Caitlyn Markham will never paint again, never graduate, never move to Colorado, never get married, never have children, never grow old. Her father will never stop wondering what she could have become. Her sister will never get back the years they should have had together. And the person responsible will barely face any real consequences. This is the untold cold case. If this story affected you, if you believe Caitlyn deserved better, if you think this sentence is an injustice, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment with your thoughts. Hit that subscribe button so we can continue bringing attention to cases like Caitlyn's, cases that deserve to be remembered, victims who deserve justice. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes justice delayed isn't justice at all. Sometimes it's just another way of letting someone get away with murder.